When I was 21, I had a sudden mystical awakening that shattered my devout Christian beliefs. And that sent me on a decade-long journey through Christianity's hidden history, lost gospels, and theological plot holes. In this video, I'm going to be discussing 3 of the theological inconsistencies I found during my historical research. And this is why I left Christianity, but I consider myself a follower of Jesus's historical teachings to the best of my understanding of what those teachings really were. You'll find a much deeper dive and all of the historical resources and citations for what I'm going to discuss today in my new book, Jesus Rewritten: How Christianity Changed His Life, Death, and Message. So if you want a deeper dive, you'll find it all in here. And this is a book for anyone who is in the process of deconstructing Christianity, anyone who has been hurt or confused by Christian doctrine but is curious about Jesus. And even if you don't come from a religious background, but you are curious about what Jesus really taught and maybe a theological or spiritual framework that makes sense, you'll find it in this book. As a little bit of background to my spiritual awakening, when I was 21, I was in a meditation and there were no substances involved. In fact, I truly believe we have everything within us to experience connection to God and heightened states of consciousness without substances. And in this meditation, I had what I would describe as an out-of-body experience. So I lost sense of my physical body, and my consciousness expanded to such a degree that I felt like I had entered a different realm, a different dimension from this expanded state of consciousness. And in this realm, I had a sense of myself as a soul that was connected to everything and everyone at all times and in all places. And that state of pure connection was ecstasy. It was bliss. It was the purest love that I've ever known or experienced. And it really shifted my concept of God and love. I could no longer accept the concepts of God and love that Christianity had presented to me. I came to believe that, or understand that, love is not an emotion, it's not a state of affection, it really is a state of consciousness that is in recognition of this connection between everyone and everything. So while I was in this expanded consciousness, in this different state of reality, I was flooded with memories of lifetimes before this one. I had certain understandings of why some souls were in my life. I had glimpses of part of my purpose here on earth. And thank goodness at the time, the rational capacities in my mind were completely closed down, because when I came back from this spiritual awakening, that was an identity crisis I had to deal with. Like, concepts like past lives were not something in my rational framework. They didn't make sense to me scientifically at the time, or certainly fit into my religious identity at the time. But while I was in that expanded state of consciousness, I wasn't thinking, I was experiencing. And then suddenly, as my consciousness had expanded, I felt myself coming back into my body, or coming back into awareness of my body. And it was like the filters in my mind that limit this expanded sense of reality were coming back online, and I was put back into what we would call like normal human consciousness, which is really only perceiving a tiny fraction of the reality and the energy that's out there. As you can imagine, after this experience, I wasn't the same, and I couldn't see the world the same way again. Most importantly, I started asking questions about Christian theology that I hadn't asked before. And I think there's a big reason for this. So growing up in Christianity, there can be a subtle message that if you, quote, lose your faith, then you lose your eternal salvation, right? If you no longer accept Christian doctrine or the Christian creeds, then you're damned to hell forever. And so what I think happened is, for me at least, that created quite a psychological block. I was given a worldview, and even though on the surface there was some encouragement to, explore this worldview and ask some questions, but not deep down, because deep down there was existential fear programmed into me that if I started questioning too far, or trusting my intuition too much, or using my critical thinking too much, then it might put my eternal salvation on the line. So a great deal of existential fear that may have shut down my critical thinking capacity for quite a while until I was 21 and had that experience. And that's when I started asking some big questions about Christianity. I started asking questions like, why is the biblical God depicted like a being that has a mind to change and a heart that breaks, a being that could ever regret making humanity and then wanted to wipe them out completely in a flood, as in the flood narrative in the Bible? This no longer computed for me because I had experienced a state of love that I came to realize God is much more a what than a who, and God is much more beingness itself than a being, especially a being like humans with a mind and a heart. I started wondering, if God is truly omnipotent, the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, how could God ever have an old and a new covenant that was changed with a human sacrifice? Why does this God give the 10 commandments according to the biblical narrative? And one of those commandments is don't murder. And yet, in the Old Testament, this God requires the murder of animals as sacrifice to cleanse people of their sins. Furthermore, what is this deity's obsession with blood? So, for example, in the Old Testament, menstrual blood makes a woman unclean, and it makes a man unclean if he touches a menstruating woman. And so, in order to get cleansed of that, a person has to go out and murder an animal, sacrifice the animal, and they're cleansed with the blood. So the blood that represents life, the blood that is arguably the only blood shed through non-violent means, through the generation of the life-giving process, that makes a person unclean, and they have to cleanse themselves with the blood that's shed through violence and harm. This really didn't make sense to me. And how is it that this God could have ever required mutilation of little boys? This is called circumcision in the Old Testament. And if you didn't know, circumcision creates death level cortisol levels for 3 days after the procedure. That is a level of stress hormones and trauma that can change the brain. And the foreskin has more nerve endings than the clitoris. It also has an energetic connection between the heart. So arguably, by removing the foreskin, there is an energetic severing that happens between the heart and the genitals, and that has to be energetically healed and recognized. And when I started researching all this, first of all, I was appalled, and my heart broke deeper than I could express. And then I started realizing, there's no way that this could have ever come from the source and the force of divine love itself. On the same confusing topic of blood and violence coming from God, I really started to question the Christian narrative that God so loved the world that he had to sacrifice his son, an innocent person, to atone or pay back the sins of all the guilty humans. Because that, first of all, is not love. Second of all, that's not justice. And it's often presented as a form of justice because God, who is the source of everything itself, somehow needed to be paid back for some things that humans did or took from this source through our, quote, sins. I really started to question all of the words that are just so casually used in this theological framework, like humans deserving hell without the sacrifice of Jesus. Like, why is, in any way, could humans deserve infinite punishment for finite sins? That's not love or justice. And why does God even have to forgive in the first place? Because what is forgiveness? It's a state of understanding. It's a heightened state of consciousness that understands why a person did what they did. And it is also a state of consciousness where the harms that we experienced from somebody else are released and healed because we have more love within us, and love cannot be harmed. Love can heal any harm that's been done. So why would God need to forgive at all if God is perhaps the highest state of love and the highest state of consciousness in existence? Those are just some of the questions that I started to ask and do some soul searching around, and they're just a few of the many questions I address in the first section of my book, which is Some Questions Christians Aren't Allowed to Ask. As I go forward in this video, I'm going to criticize some ideas. I'm going to criticize some theology. I might even use words like silly or stupid or twisted when describing some ideas. I want to be clear that I am not criticizing or attacking the people who believe these ideas. I'm not name calling the people. I am criticizing ideas, not people who hold those ideas. Now, if you're somebody who is already feeling viscerally uncomfortable, angry, triggered, just watching this video so far, it might be a sign that you have conflated your identity with your belief system. Hi, I know what that's like. I've done that in so many places in my life, not just while I was devoutly religious, but yeah, still, I'm sure many places in my life I still do this because it's part of emotional and psychological maturity. It's part of this maturation process to be able to separate our sense of identity from the beliefs and opinions that we hold so that we can critically analyze our beliefs and ideas in order to be truth seekers. In order to get closer to love and truth in our life, we have to have that emotional and psychological maturity to have a sense of peace and safety in ourselves, separate from the ideas and the worldviews that we hold. Now I'm going to get into 3 of the theological inconsistencies that I found while researching the history of Christianity. Again, 3 of many, and each one of these points could be an hour-long plus video in and of itself. So I'm just going to give a top-level overview, and like I said, the historical resources and citations are all in my book. The first major theological plot hole that I found in Christianity was the inclusion of blood atonement theology. That's how Christians would describe it. I now call it blood sacrifice superstition. The theological concept here is that God so loved the world that he had to sacrifice his son, which was an incarnation of God. Jesus was an innocent person who could basically put on his shoulders the sins of all the guilty humans who would otherwise go to hell because God needed justice, and that was justice. So if we just believe in Jesus and accept Jesus into our hearts, this allows us to get out of that form of divine retribution because sins, which could otherwise be considered just like learning cause and effect or learning love and fear here on planet Earth, would otherwise send us to infinite punishment. This is not a love story, but Christians really think it is. And here's why, my theory of why. So I was raised in an emotionally abusive home. And at the same time, my parents said, "We love you," all the time to me. So they didn't treat me in a very loving way in many cases because they were just so filled with pain that they just passed their pain on to their kids. And then they would say, "We love you." Now, I got a very warped concept of what love was from this because I correlated love with emotional abuse. And as you can imagine, my first romantic relationship in my early 20s was a man who kept saying, "I love you," and then treated me very terribly. And it took me a lot of self-reflection and like a critical analysis of what is love and how does love treat a person for me to start unraveling this confusion that I got programmed into me. So I see a lot of the same confusion happening in Christian circles because Christians are told this is love and this is a loving God, and then they're described actions that are in no way representative of love. It's not love to require a human sacrifice, and it is not justice to require the death of an innocent person to pay back for the sins of guilty people, and God doesn't need anything paid back because God is love itself. Love cannot be harmed. Love is a state of consciousness that cannot be harmed, that understands why people make the choices they do. So why did blood sacrifice get so integrated into Christian theology? One of my hypotheses is that as I was researching early cultures and early religions, it appears that blood sacrifice was just deeply rooted in early human consciousness. It is a primitive way of thinking. That's one of those points. I'm criticizing an idea. I'm not attacking people who think that way. I am saying this idea is very twisted. but it is so deeply programmed in human consciousness that I think it wove itself into Christianity, because especially ancient Judaism and Greco-Roman paganism were very steeped in blood sacrifice superstition, and those were two of the biggest religious influences on the creation of Christianity. But look, with Christianity, we have this concept of sacrifice a virgin man to appease the god, and maybe you see a parallel with a lot of the early cultures, like think Mayans throwing maidens into volcanoes. Sacrifice some virgins to appease the gods. Interestingly, when we look at historical attestation, there's a big case to be made that Jesus totally rejected animal sacrifice, that he was actually opposed to the theology of blood atonement. Like I said, this was a big piece of ancient Judaism. In fact, the temple in Jerusalem, the second Jewish temple that was built after the first one was destroyed by Babylon, this temple had channels carved into the floors so that blood from all the sacrificial animals could flow out like rivers from the temple. This is attested by early historical sources. At Passover, over 250,000 animals, primarily lambs, were slaughtered in the temple. And somehow this was considered holy, or like God needed all that blood to have humans be cleansed of their sins. No, there's nothing holy about this. This is just a primitive, barbaric way of thinking. Now, 2 points I want to make here, 2 of many historical points. You'll find more in my book. One is that when Jesus went into the temple, as is attested in the Gospels and the Bible, and he turned over the tables of the merchants and the money changers, what were they selling? They were selling animals for sacrifice. So some people interpret this as Jesus's repudiation and rejection of animal sacrifice entirely. Another interesting point is that there is a document called the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that arguably many historians believe predates the Gospel of Matthew that's in the Bible. Now, I'm going to give you some information quickly, and again, this is just an overview, but the Gospels in the Bible are written starting about 40 years after Jesus' death, starting around 70 AD for our earliest Gospel, which is the Gospel of Mark, going to around 95, even 110 AD for the Gospel of John. Growing up in church, I didn't get any information on biblical scholarship or the dating of the books in the Bible, and I just assumed that they were written by the disciples after whom these books were named, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But that's not the case. In fact, these Gospels that are now in the Bible circulated for about 100 years anonymously. The texts were not named yet. They were named later after the disciples to give them weight and credibility. But Jesus' disciples were blue-collar, illiterate, Aramaic-speaking Jews. Their illiteracy is even attested in some verses in the Bible. And the Gospels we have in the Bible were high-level literary feats written in Greek. Okay. Now, here's the interesting point. The Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. We no longer have a full copy of it because of what's called heresy hunting, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit. This has to deal with empire-funded version of Christianity wiping out earlier versions of Christianity, which were more representative of what Jesus really taught. But what we have left are scraps of this gospel that have been quoted by later authors. Some scholars, some historians believe, and I think there's an argument to be made here, that the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, written in Hebrew, not the same Gospel of Matthew in the Bible, predated the Gospel of Matthew in the Bible, and potentially could have been written by the disciple Matthew himself, who was a tax collector, who would have had some literacy. I don't know, I'm not making a case for or against that. I see why a case could be made for that. In this gospel, Jesus says, "I have come to abolish sacrifices, and if you do not cease sacrificing, the wrath will not cease from you." Now, this was a text, this Hebrew Gospel of Matthew was a text used by the Ebionites. Again, I'm going to get into them just a little bit later, but they arguably represented the earliest views of the Jesus followers, and these views were wiped out by later imperial-backed version of Christianity. Another interesting point on Jesus perhaps rejecting animal sacrifices and blood atonement theology was his Essene connection. Now, this is debated by historians and biblical scholars, and I give all the nuances and points for and against in my book. But the Essenes were a group of Jews. There were three main groups of Jews at Jesus' times: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And we know Jesus frequently criticized the Pharisees and Sadducees, at least in our biblical gospels. What about the Essenes? Well, the Essenes were a group of Jews that completely rejected the idea of blood sacrifice. In fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls were writings from one group of Essenes. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes say that the Jewish temple was corrupt. The Jewish priesthood was corrupt because of this sacrifice practice. And they called the slaughter of all these animals a, quote, Holocaust. There's historical attestation that at least two of Jesus's disciples were vegetarian. I know that's surprising to a lot of people, a lot of Christians. And perhaps Jesus himself was a vegetarian when we look at some of the documents that arguably predated our Gospels and the Bible. This is where we get some of this information. Now, the Essenes were vegetarians. This was part of their non-violent value system and their rejection of animal sacrifice. Now, this also brings up a point. What about communion? What about this fundamental blood ritual in Christianity, which I would say we could euphemistically describe as having cannibalistic overtones? Like, I never really thought about this ritual while I was indoctrinated in Christian theology. And then I had my mystical experience and I started thinking about, why am I drinking blood? Like, I mean, for Catholics, they literally think they're drinking blood and flesh of Jesus. And for other denominations, it's representative of that. But I was like, this is actually really weird. Okay, now, first of all, Jesus was a Torah-following Jew, even though in the biblical Gospels it appears that he rejects some of the Jewish law, like he heals on a Sabbath, and it appears part of his teaching is, look, guys, follow the spirit of the law, what's underneath, not just follow the letter of the law to appear righteous, okay? But all that said, he was a Torah-obedient Jew, and so were his Jewish disciples. And what is the primary dietary law in the Torah? One primary law is do not consume blood. Don't consume animal blood. So it's so historically implausible, so completely historically implausible that Jesus would have ever suggested to his disciples, here's a ritual based on drinking blood, not only animal blood, which is forbidden, but human blood. And on top of that, hey, here's a ritual of eating my flesh, when arguably, very arguably, at least two, if not all of Jesus's disciples were vegetarian, including Jesus himself. The second major theological plot hole that I found in my research was that modern Christian theology and doctrine is quite different from what Jesus's earliest followers believed. Two of the earliest groups of Jesus followers, I wouldn't use the term Christian there because Christianity developed later, were the Ebionites and the Nazarenes. And their beliefs were actually condemned as heresy by a later version of Christianity, which I would describe as empire-backed, like industrial Christianity, we would call it these days, because it had the political and the financial backing of the Roman Empire after the empire became Christian with Constantine's conversion. Constantine's conversion to Christianity is very debatable, whether that was a spiritual shift of soul and heart and mind, because he continued to murder people after his so-called conversion. He ordered the murder of his son and his wife and continued to conquer nations with armies, which is like very not what would Jesus do when we look at how Jesus lived his life according to the Gospels and the Bible. So and I go into this in my book, like, was this a conversion in word only? Was it potentially to have a cohesive religion? And when we look at Constantine's actions, that appears likely the case, because he was not motivated to create an empire-based religion on theological accuracy. I give you some quotes from him, but rather on like a consistent way of thinking. And he promoted this consistent way of thinking with violence and book burning and executions of people who diverged from that empire-sanctioned industrial version of Christianity. It was this empire-backed version of Christianity that was the most violent persecutors of early Jesus followers. Isn't this ironic? The Christianity that has now become Protestantism, Orthodoxy, and Catholicism stemmed from this industrial Christianity that persecuted and silenced the beliefs of the earliest Jesus followers. And this is why Christianity today is theologically very different than the theology we see of the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, who were like closest to Jesus in their beliefs. Arguably, you can make your own conclusions, but it's important to actually have the historical information so you can form those conclusions. And if you're interested in that, I provide it in my book. There are going to be some Christians watching this video and likely thinking, Lauren, you're just a heretic. All these ideas you're espousing are heretical. The ironic thing is they don't know the history of that word or the history of their theology. They don't know that it's quite similar to the people who call me a conspiracy theorist. Now, if you don't know my work, for over a decade now, I have been an independent health researcher and have written books and many, many articles exposing the data manipulation and the hidden corruption and the alternatives to major industries like the pharmaceutical industry, the cancer industry, the Botox industry, the fertility industry. And as you can imagine, talking about that stuff will get you labeled a conspiracy theorist very often. And at this point, it's like the people who call me a conspiracy theorist for illuminating this hidden corruption and the alternatives, they don't know that they're just a cog in the wheel in the system. Like, the system is designed to try to silence the truth tellers and the whistleblowers like me. That's part of how the system works. And we see the same dynamic in industrial Christianity. And it started early in the 4th century, where you train people to label others as heretics if they don't fall in line with the orthodox way of thinking, which is just the empire-backed, industrially approved theology. And a third major theological plot hole that I found in my research is that Christian theology today is based much more on people's private visions and revelations of Jesus than the historically recorded teachings of Jesus himself. Let me give you an example of this from another religion, from Mormonism. Joseph Smith was a psychopathic pedophile who claimed to have a private revelation of Jesus. And basically his message was, hey guys, I have this special connection to Jesus that you all don't have. I'm a prophet. And so you need me as your spiritual middleman to give you all of this divine revelation of things that you're not going to get from the Bible or from your own connection to God, because you're not special like me. You need me as the prophet in your life. And this worked. I mean, look how well this worked in history. And now Mormonism, I would say, is on its dying last gasps of breath, because so many people are waking up to what's been hidden in that religion. But that is the dynamic that happened there. One person claimed to be a prophet, claimed to have a private revelation of Jesus, and told everybody, you need me because you guys don't have this special connection that I do. And it worked. What if I told you it's worked in Christianity too? And before I go further, let me clearly illustrate the difference between a leader and a manipulator. A leader is someone who leads by example. They say, follow my actions. I'm going to go first. I'm going to do the hard thing and inspire you and show you that it can be done. And by doing it first, I can tell you how it can be done and the pitfalls to avoid. but they lead by their actions. A manipulator is someone who says, do what I say, not what I do. So we will see a lot of manipulators throughout history and in the present time who claim to be apostles or prophets or seers or whatever. Look, this happens in all religions. And they'll tell people, don't do what I do. Don't have this special connection yourself. You're not a prophet. You don't have these special spiritual gifts. I do. And so you need me as a middleman. You need to follow my instructions. It's all about disempowering the others and like positioning oneself as a spiritual authority with these special spiritual gifts. And a lot of people fall for this. It's an easy one to fall for. It really is, because the people who do this, who claim these special revelations and visions, they are often delusional, and so they carry such authority and charisma that it's easy to fall for that kind of authority. And also, people who are that level of manipulative, they just have very convincing rhetoric, and it is easy to fall for it. In Christianity, there are two individuals that claim private visions or private revelations of Jesus, and they have greatly shaped Christian theology, and their private understandings of Jesus contrast with the Jesus we see depicted in the Gospels, which is a big red flag. First of all, let's look at John of Patmos. He wrote the book of Revelation. There's a lot of competition for this, but I would argue the book of Revelation is one of the most misinterpreted books in the Bible. People think it's a prophecy of end times that are coming in the future. No, it's actually a description of the times in which John lived, and his beast, his 666, mark of the beast, all that stuff was happening in his lifetime. He was describing the events around him in metaphor based in Jewish Old Testament scripture. Yeah, mark of the beast, it already happened. They were on coins around 70 AD from Asia Minor. I go into this in the book. I also have a podcast episode on this Truth Activist podcast, which is on all major platforms. And then we can see the Jesus that John is describing from his revelation is a Jesus who wears robes dripped in blood, who carries a sword, brutally murders the beast and the people who follow the beast. Like, does that check out with the Jesus we see depicted in the Gospels? No, it doesn't. In fact, is it possible that this Jesus is a manifestation of John's desire for vengeance? Because John didn't know how to forgive, and John felt powerless and was disconnected to the power that comes from ultimate love. And so he was like, I can't take revenge. I'm too weak to take vengeance on the Roman Empire, but I'll just have a vision where Jesus is doing that for me. And that will really satiate people's egos. It satiated his ego, and it satiated the egos and the desire for vengeance of a lot of Christians. Because when we don't know how to forgive, when we haven't forgiven, that vengeance is really appealing. The Apostle Paul is another big example, and potentially very triggering example, of another person in Christianity who claimed a private revelation of Jesus, and that Jesus didn't line up with the historical Jesus in many ways. Historians really wonder how much at all Paul knew of the words Jesus spoke, because Paul arguably quotes him only one or two times and doesn't share much about Jesus's life and references his private revelation, his private vision of Jesus, where Paul integrates a lot of new theological concepts, which we see in Greco-Roman mythology. And Paul's our first introduction to communion, that ritual, which actually originated in Greco-Roman cults. I'm going to go into all this in the book. Okay, this video is getting long, and it would get so long, and there's a lot of details on this point. Paul was a self-proclaimed apostle who said that he was sharing what he called my gospel. He said that the disciples of Jesus added nothing to it. So he was not getting this from the followers of Jesus, and he had never met the living Jesus. And historical attestation shows that he was at odds with James, the brother of Jesus, who was appointed to lead Church of Jerusalem after Jesus' death. So he was at odds with the people who had walked with Jesus and knew Jesus' historical message. And Paul demeans Jesus' disciples as super apostles. It's really interesting. You're not going to learn this in a church pew. I mean, not a standard church. I never did. But this whole point around, is your religion based on somebody claiming a special connection to a religious figure that you don't have? Is that a red flag? Should that be a problem? Do you need a middleman in your spirituality? What if you can have a connection to God and to love that you don't need a middleman and you don't have to rely on these spiritual visions? And what if the people who claim these spiritual visions and say, my spiritual vision applies to you all and you need to all listen to me, what if those people tend to have some big ego issues? I've noticed that. Look, I don't have a problem if you're out there saying, I had a spiritual vision that applies to my life personally. That's how I live my life. I have spiritual guidance that applies to me, and I go out and I do it. I'm not out here saying, I've had a spiritual vision and you all need me as your leader and your guru and your cult leader. So, because you all don't have that skill. You all have it within you. We all have it within us. And we don't need these spiritual middlemen who tend to have some real raging ego issues and vengeance issues. So those are 3 of the theological inconsistencies I found in Christian theology as I was doing my research. And I'm not here to change anyone's mind or take anyone's religious beliefs away from them. I'm just here to be an example of somebody who started to critically think about some topics that I had just accepted without deeply thinking about them. And to be an example of someone who applies my own spiritual and intuitive discernment to ideas and did my own research. And I encourage you all to do the same. Don't just swallow what I'm saying. Do the research yourself. Use your own critical thinking and your own intuitive discernment. And if you want a jumping off point for that, you'll find a lot of information and thought-provoking questions in Jesus Rewritten. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching. And I do welcome conversation on this video. I'd love to hear some of the questions you've asked, maybe your own spiritual journey. I do want to be clear that I welcome comments that are written in the spirit of respect and dignity, compassion, curiosity. So if comments contain insults or just condemnations to hell, I will delete those, especially if you are claiming to be a Christian in your username or your comment and you're insulting me or other people. I'm going to hold you to a higher standard of Christ-like behavior with your communication, right? Just for the well-being of other people who call themselves Christians. They don't need you out there giving them a bad name because you're putting hateful comments on the internet, okay? So I do welcome mature, respectful, rational, and open-hearted conversation. All that to say that. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.